Jake Morrison pressed his face against the thick glass window of the transport ship and watched the massive research station grow larger in the distance. The Nexus 7 space station looked like a giant metal flower floating in the black void of space, its biodome petals glowing with soft artificial light. Behind it, the swirling orange and red clouds of the gas giant Kepler 442b created a backdrop that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. "First time seeing a research station this size?" asked the ship's pilot, a friendly woman named Captain Davis, who had been making supply runs to Nexus 7 for the past 5 years. Jake nodded, unable to take his eyes off the approaching station. "Back on Earth, the biggest space facility I ever saw was the Luna Colony's agricultural dome. And that was tiny compared to this thing," Captain Davis laughed. "Wait until you see the inside. The Galactic Academic Exchange Program really went all out when they built this place. You've got biodomes from 70 different star systems, laboratories that can simulate any environment in known space, and living quarters designed for over 200 different species." Jake felt a mix of excitement and nervousness in his stomach. He was 22 years old, had just finished his 3rd year studying xenobiology at Colorado State University, and had been selected as one of only 12 humans to participate in the exchange program this cycle. His professors had told him it was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to study alien life forms up close and work alongside students from across the galaxy. The docking process took almost an hour, and Jake spent the time reviewing the files he had been given about his fellow exchange students. There would be 26 students total, representing 15 different species. Some of the names were impossible for him to pronounce, but he had practiced the basic greeting phrases in Universal Standard, the common language used throughout the Federation. Zixthara came from the Andorian Collective, a species that looked like living crystals and communicated through light patterns. Kelmpor was from the Hive Worlds, an arthropod species with 6 arms and natural armor plating. Yuki represented the Taotian Empire, a humanoid species known for their advanced mental abilities and calm demeanor. Each species brought their own unique perspective to the study of life in the galaxy. When the docking clamps finally engaged with a solid thunk, Jake gathered his 2 bags of belongings and followed Captain Davis through the airlock. The first thing that hit him was the smell. Not bad, just different. The air recycling systems had to accommodate the breathing requirements of dozens of species, and the result was a slightly metallic scent mixed with something that reminded him of pine trees. Professor Nevtol was waiting to greet the new arrivals. She was a Zilithian, which meant she looked somewhat like a giant octopus that had learned to walk upright. Her skin was a deep purple color that shifted to blue when she was pleased, and her 4 tentacles moved with surprising grace as she gestured for the students to follow her. "Welcome to Nexus 7, she said through the universal translator device clipped to her teaching robes. "I am Professor Nevtol, and I will be your primary instructor during your time here." The station operates on a 26-hour cycle to accommodate the biological needs of our diverse student body, and meals are served at regular intervals in the main cafeteria. Jake joined the group of students following Professor Nevtol through the station's corridors. The walls were lined with viewing windows that showed glimpses of the various biodomes they passed. In one, he could see what looked like a forest of silver trees under purple light. In another, strange, jellyfish-like creatures floated through a misty environment that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The station contains 47 different biodomes, Professor Nevtol continued as they walked. Each one represents a different planetary environment and houses specimens from various worlds throughout the galaxy. During your 6-month stay, you will have the opportunity to study life forms that most beings never encounter in their entire lives. Jake's roommate turned out to be Kelmpor, the arthropod student from the Hive Worlds. Their shared quarters were larger than Jake had expected, with adjustable lighting and 2 sleeping areas designed to accommodate different physiological needs. Kelmpor's area had a hard platform with heating elements, while Jake's section had a standard human-style bed and desk. "Your species requires soft sleeping surfaces," Kelmpor observed, his translator making his chittering voice sound curious. rather than judgmental. This is interesting. On my world, we rest on heated stone platforms. Yeah, humans like things pretty soft, Jake replied, unpacking his clothes into the storage unit. We're kind of fragile compared to most species, from what I understand. Kelmpor made a sound that the translator interpreted as laughter. Fragile perhaps, but your species has a reputation for being remarkably adaptable. The Hive World's archives contain many records of human ingenuity in difficult situations. The first week of classes was overwhelming in the best possible way. Jake found himself studying organisms that challenged everything he thought he knew about life. There were creatures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, plants that could think and communicate, and microorganisms that seemed to bend the laws of physics. His favorite discovery was the Glow-Beetles from the Rigel system. These insects were about the size of Earth's June bugs, but they could produce light in dozens of different colors and patterns. They lived in large colonies in Biome 7, feeding on the nectar of flowering plants that had been transported from their homeworld. The Glow-Beetles used their bioluminescence for complex communication, Professor Nevtile explained during one of their lab sessions. Each color pattern conveys different information, warning signals, mating calls, territorial boundaries. They are remarkably intelligent for such small creatures. Jake spent hours watching the Glow-Beetles through the biodome's observation windows. He noticed that they had predictable behavior patterns, feeding at certain times during the artificial day cycle and clustering in specific areas of the dome based on light conditions. His human tendency to observe and categorize served him well in his studies. The alien students seemed to find Jake's approach to learning fascinating, while many of them had advanced technological aids for recording and analyzing data. Jake relied on handwritten notes and simple sketches. Zixthara's crystal form would often pulse with curiosity when she watched him work. Your species processes information in a very direct way, she observed during one of their study sessions. You seem to understand things by breaking them down into smaller parts. That's pretty much how humans learn everything, Jake replied. We take complex things and figure out how they work piece by piece. The station's routine was comfortable and predictable. Meals were served in the main cafeteria, where food synthesizers created appropriate nutrition for each species. Jake's meals usually consisted of something that tasted like a cross between chicken and fish, along with synthesized vegetables and fruits. The alien students ate various pastes, liquids, and energy supplements that looked completely unappetizing. To human eyes, everything worked smoothly because the station was designed to be self-sufficient. Automated supply ships arrived from the core worlds every 2 weeks, bringing fresh molecular compounds for the food synthesizers and replacement parts for the station systems. The students could focus entirely on their studies without worrying about the practical details of survival in space. Jake had been on the station for 3 weeks when the first sign of trouble appeared. Professor Nevtal seemed more agitated than usual during their morning lecture about symbiotic relationships in extreme environments. Her tentacles moved with quick, nervous gestures, and her skin color kept shifting between purple and a worried shade of green. The supply ship scheduled to arrive yesterday has been delayed, she announced to the class. This is not unusual, but the food synthesizers are programmed to operate on a precise schedule. If the delay continues, we may need to reduce meal portions temporarily. The alien students accepted this news with calm understanding. Delays were part of space travel, and they trusted that their advanced technology would handle any temporary inconvenience. Jake felt a small knot of worry in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. After all, they were on a sophisticated research station operated by the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. What could possibly go wrong? The food synthesizers started making strange noises on the second day after the supply ship failed to arrive. Jake noticed it first during breakfast when the machine that usually hummed quietly began producing grinding sounds followed by mechanical clicks. The paste that came out looked thinner than normal and had an odd gray color instead of the usual brown. Something is wrong with the food production systems, Kelmpor observed, poking at his meal with one of his 6 arms. The arthropod's natural armor plating seemed to dim slightly when he was worried, and Jake could see the concern in his compound eyes. Zixthara's crystal form flickered with patterns that Jake had learned meant confusion. The molecular structure appears incomplete, she said, her light-based communication translated through the universal device. Essential nutrients are missing from this mixture. Jake took a bite of his own meal and immediately noticed the difference. The synthesized food tasted flat and left him feeling unsatisfied even after finishing the entire portion. His stomach made a small growling sound that seemed unusually loud in the quiet cafeteria. Professor Nevtal entered the dining area with her tentacles moving in quick, agitated patterns. Her skin had shifted to a deep green color that Jake now recognized as a sign of serious concern. She moved from table to table, speaking quietly with small groups of students. "The food synthesizers are experiencing technical difficulties," she announced when she reached Jake's table. "The backup molecular compounds are not sufficient to maintain full nutritional value. We are working to resolve the issue, but meals may be less satisfying for the next few days." That afternoon during their study session in Biodome 12, Jake found it difficult to concentrate. His stomach kept making noises and he felt a persistent hunger that the morning's meal had not satisfied. The other students seemed to be experiencing similar problems. Yuki, who normally maintained perfect posture during lectures, was slouching in her chair. Even the usually energetic Kelmpor moved more slowly than usual. "The supply ship situation is more serious than we initially thought," Professor Nefta admitted when one of the students asked about the timeline for a normal food service. "Communication with the core worlds indicates that our regular supply vessel encountered mechanical problems 2 days out from our system. A replacement ship has been dispatched, but it will take at least 6 days to reach us." Jake felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the biodome's climate control. 6 days was a long time to go without proper nutrition, especially when the backup systems were already failing. He looked around at his alien classmates and saw worry beginning to show in their various ways of expressing emotion. By the third day, the food synthesizers were producing what could only be described as colored water with a slightly thicker consistency than normal. The machines made grinding noises constantly now, and twice during the day they shut down completely for several hours. Jake's hunger had become a constant ache in his stomach, and he noticed that his hands were starting to shake slightly. The alien students were showing more obvious signs of distress. Zixthara's crystal form had grown so dim that she was barely visible except when she was directly under the artificial lights. Kelmpor had stopped moving 3 of his arms entirely, conserving energy by keeping them folded against his body. Yuki's normally smooth skin had taken on a grayish color, and she moved with the careful slowness of someone trying to preserve their strength. "This is unprecedented," Professor Nevtal told the assembled students during an emergency meeting in the main laboratory. "The research station has never experienced a complete food system failure. The backup systems were designed to maintain basic nutrition for up to 2 weeks, but the molecular compounds we have remaining are insufficient." Jake watched his classmates' reactions with growing alarm. The alien students seemed to be accepting the situation with a kind of resigned panic. They had grown up in civilizations where food scarcity was unknown, where advanced technology ensured that hunger was a historical concept rather than a real possibility. "What happens if the rescue ship doesn't arrive in time?" asked Morden, a student from the Proxima colonies whose species resembled walking trees. His bark-like skin had developed stress cracks, and his leaf hair was beginning to wilt. Professor Nevtal's tentacles writhed in a pattern that Jake recognized as extreme distress. "The Federation has never lost a research station to supply failure," she said carefully. "Emergency protocols exist, but they have never been tested under these conditions." That night, Jake lay in his bed listening to Kelmpor's labored breathing from the other side of their shared quarters. The arthropod had entered what he called a conservation state, slowing his metabolism to preserve energy. Most of the other alien students were doing similar things, using biological adaptations that their species had developed for different purposes. Jake stared at the ceiling and felt his stomach cramp with hunger. Unlike his classmates, humans had no special biological mechanisms for surviving food shortages. They were adapted for persistence and endurance, but they still needed regular nutrition to function properly. He thought about the camping trips he had taken with his father in the Colorado mountains, where they had sometimes run short of supplies and had to be creative about finding food. His father had taught him to identify edible plants, to set simple traps for small animals, and to fish with improvised equipment. At the time, Jake had thought of it as fun outdoor activities, but now he realized that his father had been teaching him survival skills that most humans had forgotten in their technologically advanced society. The fourth day brought complete failure of the food synthesizers. The machines shut down with a series of mechanical groans and refused to restart despite Professor Nevtul's increasingly desperate attempts to repair them. The emergency rations that were supposed to last 2 weeks had been consumed in 4 days. Because the synthesizers had been using them inefficiently, Jake found himself in the main laboratory with his classmates, all of them gathered around Professor Nevtul as she tried to contact the Federation Emergency Services. The alien students had moved into what appeared to be various forms of hibernation or energy conservation mode. Some were completely motionless, while others moved with painful slowness. "The rescue ship is still 3 days away," Professor Nevtul announced, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have sent distress signals on all emergency frequencies. But there are no other vessels in this system that can reach us in time." Zixthara's crystal form pulsed with a barely visible light. "My species can survive approximately 2 more days without nutrition," she said weakly. "After that, our crystalline matrix begins to destabilize." Kelmpor made a sound that the translator interpreted as a sigh. "The hive worlds prepared us for many challenges, but not for this. We have no knowledge of survival without technological support." Jake stood up from his position near the observation window, his legs shaky from hunger but his mind suddenly clear. While his classmates were accepting what seemed like an inevitable crisis, he was remembering lessons from his childhood camping trips. He looked out at the biodomes that surrounded them, filled with thousands of different life forms from across the galaxy. "There has to be something we can do," he said, his voice cutting through the atmosphere of despair. "We're surrounded by biodomes full of living organisms. Some of them have to be edible." Professor Nevtile's tentacles moved sharply. "Those are protected research specimens. The Federation would revoke our permits and shut down the entire program if we interfered with the biodome ecosystems." But Jake was already thinking beyond regulations and permits. His father had taught him that survival sometimes required making hard choices and taking calculated risks. He looked at his dying classmates and felt a determination that surprised him with its intensity. "I'm not talking about destroying the ecosystems," he said quietly. "I'm talking about finding a way to live until help arrives." That night, while his alien classmates lay in their dormitories in various states of metabolic slowdown, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find a way to keep them all alive, even if it meant breaking a few rules in the process. Jake waited until the station's artificial night cycle had begun before making his move. The corridors were dimly lit with emergency lighting, and most of his classmates were in their dormitories trying to conserve energy. He had spent the evening thinking about which biodome offered the best chance of finding edible organisms without disrupting the research ecosystems. Biodome 7 was his choice. He had been studying the Rigelian Glow-Beetles there for his research project and knew their behavior patterns better than any other species on the station. The beetles were numerous, reproduced quickly, and his biological scans had shown they contained high levels of protein and essential amino acids. Most importantly, they lived in large colonies where the removal of a few individuals would not impact the overall population. The access door to Biodome 7 required his student identification card, which still worked despite the emergency situation. Jake slipped inside and was immediately hit by the warm, humid air that simulated the climate of the Rigel system. The dome was filled with strange plants that glowed softly in the darkness, creating an otherworldly forest of blue and purple light. The Glow-Beetles were active during the night cycle. their bioluminescent bodies creating patterns of communication throughout the artificial forest. Jake could see hundreds of them moving through the air, their lights blinking in complex sequences that he had learned indicated everything from territorial boundaries to mating calls. They were beautiful creatures, and part of him felt guilty about what he was planning to do. But when he remembered Zixthara's dimming crystal form and Kelmpor's weakening voice, his resolve strengthened. These were his friends, and they were dying. The Federation's research protocols seemed less important than keeping his classmates alive long enough for the rescue ship to arrive. Jake had brought 3 items with him from his dormitory: a clean sock from his laundry bag, a thin maintenance rod he had taken from the supply closet, and a small specimen container from the laboratory. His plan was simple in concept but would require patience and careful timing to execute. He had observed that the Glow-Beetles followed predictable patterns during their night feeding cycle. They would descend from the upper levels of the dome to feed on the nectar of the flowering plants near the ground, staying low for approximately 20 minutes before returning to their roosting areas in the artificial canopy. During this feeding time, they were less alert to potential threats and more focused on gathering food. Jake found a position near a cluster of Rigelian honeyflowers, plants that looked like giant blue roses with petals that pulsed with soft light. The sweet scent they produced was almost overwhelming, but the Glow-Beetles seemed to find it irresistible. He could see dozens of them approaching through the artificial twilight, their bodies creating a moving constellation of colored lights. Setting up his improvised trap required careful positioning. Jake stretched his sock between the maintenance rod and a sturdy plant stem, creating a makeshift net that would be invisible to the beetles until it was too late. The sock was made of a synthetic material that was strong enough to hold the insects, but flexible enough to avoid injuring them during capture. The waiting was the hardest part. Jake crouched in the shadows near his trap, trying to remain perfectly still as the Glow-Beetles began their feeding ritual. His stomach cramped with hunger, and his hands shook slightly from the lack of proper nutrition, but he forced himself to stay focused. His father had taught him that successful hunting required patience above all else. The first beetle approached his trap cautiously, its light patterns indicating that it was testing the area for danger. Jake held his breath and remained motionless, knowing that any sudden movement would alert the entire swarm to his presence. The beetle landed on one of the honeyflowers and began feeding, its bioluminescent body pulsing with satisfaction. More beetles joined the first one, and soon Jake had a small group of them feeding directly in front of his trap. He waited until 3 of them were positioned perfectly, then made his move. With a quick motion, he swept the sock net through the air, catching the beetles before they could react or signal danger to their companions. The captured beetles pulsed with agitation in the makeshift net, their light patterns shifting to what Jake recognized as distress signals. He felt a pang of guilt as he carefully transferred them to the specimen container, but he reminded himself that he was taking only 3 individuals from a population of several thousand. The impact on the colony would be minimal, and the alternative was watching his classmates die. Jake made his way back through the biodome, avoiding the areas where the remaining Glow-Beetles were feeding. The 3 captured insects continued to flash their distress signals, but the container was designed to contain bioluminescent specimens, and their lights were not visible from the outside. He reached the access door without incident and slipped back into the station's corridors. The laboratory was empty at this hour, but Jake had access to all the equipment he needed. He began by using the molecular analyzer to confirm what he already suspected about the Glow-Beetle's nutritional value. The readout showed protein levels comparable to Earth's insects, along with amino acid profiles that would be compatible with most carbon-based life forms. Processing the beetles required delicate work. Jake used the laboratory's bioextraction equipment to separate the edible protein from the non-digestible parts of the insect's bodies. The process was similar to techniques he had learned for preparing biological samples, but he had to be careful not to damage the nutritional components. The result was a small amount of pale, protein-rich paste that looked similar to the food that the synthesizers had been producing before they failed. Jake tested a tiny amount himself, finding that it tasted bland but not unpleasant. More importantly, it immediately began to ease the gnawing hunger in his stomach. Jake divided the protein paste into small portions and began preparing a presentation for his classmates. He knew that some of them would be horrified by what he had done, but he also knew that they were desperate enough to listen to his reasoning. The rescue ship was still 2 days away, and without nutrition, several of his classmates would not survive that long. He spent the rest of the night analyzing the biodome's ecosystem data, calculating how many beetles could be safely harvested without disrupting the colony's reproductive cycle. The numbers were encouraging. The Glow-Beetles had a fast reproduction rate and a natural mortality rate. That was higher than what he would need to take to keep his classmates alive. When the artificial dawn began to lighten the station's corridors, Jake gathered his materials and prepared to face his fellow students. He had no idea how they would react to his solution, but he knew that desperate times called for desperate measures. His father had taught him that survival sometimes required making choices that others might not understand, but that were necessary for the greater good. Jake took a deep breath and headed toward the main laboratory, carrying with him the means to save his classmates' lives and possibly change their understanding of what it meant to survive in a hostile universe. The protein paste felt warm in his hands, and he could only hope that his friends would be willing to accept help that came from such an unexpected source. Jake found his classmates gathered in the main laboratory when he arrived with his small container of processed Glow-Beetle protein. The alien students looked worse than they had the day before, their various forms of distress becoming more pronounced as their energy reserves continued to decline. Zixtara's crystal form was so dim that she was barely visible even under the bright laboratory lights, while Kelmpor had curled into a tight ball with only 2 of his 6 arms still moving. Professor Nevtal was at the communication console, her tentacles moving frantically as she tried to reach the rescue ship. Her skin had turned a pale green color that Jake had never seen before, and her movements seemed sluggish and uncoordinated. The lack of proper nutrition was affecting everyone, but the professor was pushing herself harder than anyone else, trying to find a solution to their crisis. The rescue ship has encountered solar storm activity, Professor Nevtal announced to the assembled students. Their estimated arrival time has been delayed by another 6 hours. We may need to consider more drastic emergency measures. Jake cleared his throat, and the sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet laboratory. I think I might have found a temporary solution, he said, holding up the container of protein paste. It's not much, but it should help keep everyone alive until the rescue ship arrives. Yuki lifted her head with obvious effort, her normally bright eyes now dull with exhaustion. What kind of solution? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake took a deep breath and prepared himself for their reactions. I harvested some Glow-Beetles from Biodome 7 and processed them into edible protein. The molecular analysis shows they're highly nutritious and compatible with most carbon-based life forms. The silence that followed his announcement was profound. Jake could hear the soft humming of the laboratory equipment and the distant sounds of the station's life support systems, but none of his classmates made a sound. Professor Nevtal's tentacles had frozen in mid-motion, and her skin was shifting through colors that Jake had never seen before. Zixtara's crystal form flickered with what Jake recognized as confusion and disbelief. You killed living organisms? She asked, her light-based communication translated with an undertone of shock. You took the lives of research specimens for food? I harvested 3 individuals from a population of several thousand, Jake corrected. Gently, the impact on the colony is minimal, and the alternative was watching all of you die from starvation. Kelmpor uncurled slightly, his compound eyes focusing on Jake with what appeared to be a mixture of horror and fascination. Your species consumes other living beings for survival, he said, his chittering voice carrying a tone that the translator struggled to interpret. This is not theoretical knowledge for you. Jake nodded, realizing that his classmates were confronting a concept that was completely foreign to their experiences. Most life forms on Earth survive by consuming other life forms. Plants, animals, microorganisms, it's all part of natural cycles that have existed for millions of years. Humans evolved as omnivores, which means we can eat both plants and animals. Professor. Neville finally found her voice, though her tentacles continued to move in agitated patterns. You violated research protocols, she said, but her tone lacked the anger that Jake had expected. Those specimens are protected under Federation preservation guidelines. I understand that, Jake replied, but I also understand that protocols don't matter if we're all dead when the rescue ship arrives. I took only what was necessary, and I made sure not to disrupt the ecosystem balance. Morden, the tree-like student from the Proxima colonies, made a sound that resembled wind through leaves. How did you know which organisms were safe to consume? He asked, how did you determine the proper processing methods? Jake explained his analysis process, showing them the molecular scan results and the calculations he had made about sustainable harvesting. As he spoke, he could see his classmates beginning to understand the logic behind his actions, even if they still struggled with the concept. The protein content is remarkable, Yuki observed, examining the data on Jake's portable scanner. These beetles contain all the essential amino acids required for our basic metabolism. Jake began distributing small portions of the processed protein to his classmates, explaining how much each species should consume based on their biological requirements. The portions were tiny, but they represented concentrated nutrition that would help stabilize their declining condition. Zixthara was the first to try the protein paste, her crystal form pulsing with hesitation before she absorbed the small amount through specialized feeding channels. Within minutes, her bioluminescence began to brighten noticeably, and her communication patterns became more coherent. The effect is immediate, she reported with amazement. My energy levels are stabilizing for the first time in days. One by one, the other students consumed their portions of the beetle protein. Kelmporous chittering became stronger and more animated, while Yuki's skin began to regain some of its natural color. Even Professor Nevtal accepted a small amount, though she continued to express concern about the violation of research protocols. This is unprecedented, Professor Nevtal said, her tentacles moving in patterns that Jake was learning to recognize, as intellectual excitement mixed with professional worry. In all my years of xenobiological research, I have never encountered a species that could so quickly adapt to survival situations. Jake spent the next several hours teaching his classmates about sustainable harvesting techniques. He showed them how to identify the optimal times for collection, how to select individuals that would have minimal impact on the population, and how to monitor the ecosystem to ensure long-term stability. The key is understanding the natural cycles, Jake explained as they reviewed biodome data in the laboratory. Every ecosystem has natural mortality rates and reproductive patterns. If you work within those patterns, you can harvest resources without causing damage. Kelmpor proved to be a surprisingly quick student, using his 6 arms to practice the collection techniques that Jake demonstrated. The hive worlds have legends about primitive times when our ancestors had to gather food manually, he said. I never imagined that such skills could still be useful. Zixthara's crystal form brightened as she processed the new information. Your species maintains knowledge of survival techniques even in advanced technological societies, she observed. This suggests a level of practical wisdom that our civilizations may have lost. As the day progressed, Jake established a rotation schedule for beetle collection, ensuring that no single area of the biodome would be overharvested. He taught his classmates to create simple tools from laboratory equipment and maintenance supplies, showing them how human ingenuity could turn common objects into survival instruments. The improvement in his classmates' condition was remarkable. Within 6 hours of consuming the beetle protein, they had regained enough strength to move around normally and participate in the harvesting activities. The crisis atmosphere in the laboratory was replaced by a sense of cautious optimism and growing respect for Jake's practical knowledge. I am beginning to understand why humans have such a reputation throughout the galaxy, Professor Nevtal said as she watched Jake demonstrate how to fashion a collection net from laboratory filters and support rods. Your species combines technological advancement with primitive survival instincts in ways that other civilizations have forgotten. That evening, as they prepared their second meal of processed beetle protein, Jake noticed that his classmates were looking at him differently. The initial shock and horror had been replaced by curiosity and admiration. They were beginning to see that his violation of protocols had not been reckless destruction, but careful resource management based on deep understanding of natural systems. The rescue ship was still more than a day away, but for the first time since the crisis began, Jake felt confident that all of his classmates would survive to see it arrive. The rescue ship arrived 18 hours later than originally scheduled, but by then the crisis had transformed into something none of the students or faculty had expected. Captain Rodriguez and her crew found the research station not only functioning normally but operating with an efficiency that surprised everyone who had been monitoring the emergency situation from the Federation headquarters. Jake stood with his classmates in the main docking bay as the rescue team disembarked, carrying emergency food supplies and medical equipment that were no longer desperately needed. The alien students looked healthy and alert, a stark contrast to the dying beings that the rescue team had expected to find based on the distress signals that had been sent 3 days earlier. "Status report," Captain Rodriguez requested as she approached Professor Nevtal. The captain was a middle-aged human woman with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone who had handled dozens of emergency situations throughout her career. "Our scans indicate that all life signs on the station are stable, but we received reports of complete food system failure." Professor Nevtal's tentacles moved in patterns that Jake now recognized as a mixture of pride and professional embarrassment. "The situation was resolved through unconventional means," she said carefully. "One of our students developed alternative food sources using station resources." Captain Rodriguez looked around at the assembled students, her eyes stopping when she reached Jake. "You're the human exchange student mentioned in the reports," she said with interest. "I understand you improvised some kind of survival solution." Jake felt slightly uncomfortable being the center of attention, but he nodded and explained briefly what he had done. As he spoke, Captain Rodriguez's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine amazement, and the other members of her rescue team began gathering around to listen. "You caught insects with a sock and a stick," Captain Rodriguez repeated slowly, as if she wanted to make sure she had heard correctly. "And you processed them into edible protein using laboratory equipment." "It was just basic survival techniques," Jake said, feeling embarrassed by the attention. "My father taught me camping skills when I was growing up, and I applied them to the situation we were facing." Captain Rodriguez turned to address Professor Nevtal. "In 30 years of emergency response operations, I have never encountered a situation where stranded personnel not only solved their own crisis but actually improved their understanding of survival techniques in the process. This is going to be a very interesting report to file with Federation Command." The rescue team spent several hours documenting what had happened on the station, interviewing each of the students about their experiences and observations. Jake found himself answering detailed questions about his harvesting techniques, his analysis methods, and his decision-making process during the crisis. "What impressed me most was the sustainable approach," Yuki told Captain Rodriguez during her interview. "Jake didn't just solve the immediate problem. He created a system that could have sustained us indefinitely if necessary." Kelmpor demonstrated the collection techniques he had learned, using his 6 arms to show how he could gather beetles more efficiently than Jake's original two-handed method. "The human approach to problem-solving is remarkably adaptable," he explained. Instead of relying on existing technology, he created new solutions from available materials. Zixthara's crystal form pulsed with bright patterns as she described her experience. "Before this crisis, I believe that advanced technology had made primitive survival skills obsolete," she said. "Now, I understand that such skills represent a form of intelligence that complements technological advancement rather than replacing it. The rescue team's medical officer, Dr. Patel, was particularly interested in the nutritional analysis that Jake had performed. The protein extraction and processing techniques you developed could have applications beyond emergency situations, she told him. The Federation's frontier colonies often struggle with food production in hostile environments. Captain Rodriguez spent considerable time reviewing the biodome monitoring data that showed how Jake's harvesting had actually improved the ecosystem balance in several domes. By removing excess populations and creating more diverse food webs, you accidentally optimized the research environments, she observed. The beetle colonies are healthier now than they were before the crisis. Professor Nevtal had initially worried about facing disciplinary action for allowing a student to violate research protocols, but as the rescue team's investigation continued, it became clear that Jake's actions would be viewed as innovative problem-solving rather than protocol violations. The Federation Council will want to study these techniques, Captain Rodriguez informed Professor Nevtal. There's already discussion about incorporating survival training into the standard curriculum for all exchange programs. Jake spent his remaining time on the station teaching his techniques to anyone who wanted to learn. Several of the alien students proved to be natural foragers once they understood the basic principles, and they began identifying other potential food sources within the various biodomes. Humans have something that we call practical creativity, Jake explained to a group of students who were learning to make collection tools. We look at problems and see opportunities, and we're not afraid to try unconventional solutions if conventional ones don't work. The story of what happened on Nexus 7 spread quickly through the Federation's academic networks. Jake found himself receiving invitations to speak at universities throughout the galaxy, sharing his experiences and teaching survival techniques to students from dozens of different species. Professor Nevtal's final report to the Federation became required reading. At survival training academies across known space, the human student Jake Morrison demonstrated capabilities that challenge our understanding of adaptive intelligence, she wrote. His ability to see resources where others saw only obstacles, to create tools from common objects, and to maintain analytical thinking under extreme stress represents a significant evolutionary advantage. When Jake returned to Earth 6 months later, he carried with him more than just his xenobiology degree. He had letters of recommendation from alien professors, invitations to lecture at Federation academies, and offers to join frontier exploration teams that valued his survival skills. The University of Colorado created a new course called Practical Xenobiology based on Jake's experiences, and students from across human space applied to study survival techniques that had once been considered obsolete. Jake became an instructor, teaching young humans to combine their species' natural adaptability with scientific knowledge. Years later, when frontier colonies faced food shortages or equipment failures, the first response was often to send a human advisor trained in what became known as the Morrison method. The simple techniques of observation, improvisation, and sustainable resource management that Jake had learned from his father became standard training for anyone working in challenging environments. The sock and stick trap that had started as a desperate survival measure became a symbol of human ingenuity throughout the galaxy. Alien students studying Earth culture often began their education by learning about the day when a hungry human saved a research station using nothing more than creativity, determination, and the willingness to try something that had never been done before. Jake often smiled when he heard these stories, remembering how scared and hungry he had been during those desperate days on Nexus 7. He had simply done what seemed necessary at the time, using skills his father had taught him and applying them to a situation that no human had ever faced before. Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one, he would tell his students. You just have to be willing to see possibilities where others see only problems.